Brain physiology. The brain is arguably the most complex thing we know about in science. So let's start talking about it. Let me say right off the bat that we're going to cover a lot more detail than I expect you to be able to remember. What I'm trying to do is give you an overview. Hopefully you can just get the basics of what's going on. I'll ask some details, of course, but I'm thinking of giving you something comprehensive here in these PowerPoints that you can continue to use in nursing school, dental hygiene school, pharmacy school, so on. So just do your best. There's too much here to completely master. Just do your best to get an overall conception of what's going on and try to get to the main points. So, major regions of the brain, the cerebrum. When you think of your brain, you're probably thinking mostly of the cerebrum, composed of two cerebral hemispheres, left and right. It's the so-called seat of intelligence. Your brain is where you do thinking, reasoning, problem solving, learning, memory, emotions, personality, and so on. A lot of people think of the brain as thinking, but they don't really realize the brain is also where your emotions are. They're not really in your heart. And your personality. A lot of people think, well, I'll be me no matter what happens. No, actually, people that suffer brain injury sometimes have completely different personalities even if they get better physically. If you've taken an intro psych class, you may have heard about Phineas Gage and so on. That's not uncommon. A lot of times people after severe brain injury or in a coma, they'll warn the families that when they come out of the coma, if they come out, they may not be the same person you knew. So the brain stem is what takes care of survival stuff. Midbrain, pons, and medulla connects the rest of the brain to the spinal cord, and this is where you're controlling the things that you don't want to have to think consciously about. Your heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing. The brainstem is what's keeping you alive so you can do the more important things like, watch video games and play video games, watch movies, whatever. So that's the brainstem. So cerebrum is the intelligence, the personality, the emotions. Brainstem is just keeping you alive. Now, of course, the two of those have to be able to talk to each other, and that's the diencephalon. Diencephalon, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. It's basically the communication command post linking the brainstem and the cerebrum. So the cerebrum needs to know about your heart rate and your breathing and so on. It can do some overriding of those things. So the two have to communicate with one another. The brainstem has to tell the cerebrum what's going on, and the cerebrum may need to make some adjustments and so on. And then finally, movement is such a big deal that we have a part of the brain that's really completely in charge of movement. It's not where the movement comes from. When I decide to move my arm, and then I move my arm, those commands are coming most directly from the cerebrum. But the cerebellum also has two hemispheres, left and right. Its job is to coordinate and smooth complex movements. So, like if I'm thirsty and there's a glass of water and I reach out to grab the glass of water, think of all the muscles involved. Think of how I have to coordinate my eyes to see where it is. Think about it. In order to move my arm and my hand to grab the glass, I'm going to have to involve probably pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, deltoid, biceps brachii, coracobrachialis, flexor carpi radialis, and so on. All those muscles need to be precisely coordinated so that we do that in a smooth, even, easy kind of way. And that's a big job of the cerebellum. Also regulates balance and posture. That makes sense because just standing up or sitting up requires hundreds of muscles to do that. You've seen somebody who's really drunk. You try to sit them up and they slouch over and stuff like that. So those are the four main parts of the brain. I want you to keep these in mind as we go through all the rest of the brain. This is a big deal. Keep in mind the difference between what the cerebrum is doing, the brainstem, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum. That will help you sort this all out. There are many ways, by the way, to organize the brain, and developmentally we can talk about the rhombencephalon and the telencephalon and so on. I'm doing it functionally here. These are the four big functional parts of the brain. When you look at other animals, vertebrates in particular, our brains are very similar. Once you get down into insects, it's a little bit different. But look kind of developmentally at fish. upper left-hand corner, it's got all the parts we were talking about. But look how they're different in size. Fish, not much cerebrum, a lot of cerebellum. Think about fish. They're having to coordinate all those fins. They're moving through a three-dimensional space under the water. It takes a lot of coordination of movement. On the other hand, cerebrum, yeah, fish not known for, algebra and poetry. Look down at the frog, hardly any cerebellum. I mean, what kind of movement do frogs do? Kerplunk, kerplunk, kerplunk. Not very sophisticated at all. But look at how frogs have more cerebrum. Frogs are moving in between the water and the land, all right? So they have to be able to survive and find prey in both places. So they kind of have a lot more to think about than fish do. Once you get to birds, holy smoke, look at that. Birds, smart. Look at all that cerebrum. I would say my 3 kids, birds are like in between my youngest and my second youngest. Look at the cerebellum, massive, now starting to have wrinkles to increase surface area. Birds, again, moving through three-dimensional space. Look at how incredibly coordinated birds are when they're flying. And birds are also very smart, African gray parrots and so on. And then by the time you look at the human brain, look at all the wrinkles. That's a way of increasing surface area within a fixed amount of space. And the cerebellum all wrinkled as well. Humans, we have sophisticated movements and we do a lot of thinking. Vertebrate brain, look at how, everybody has 2 cerebral hemispheres. Look at all the wrinkles. That's increasing the surface area. We're remarkably similar to other vertebrates. I mean, this is just mammals, but even down into reptiles and stuff. The brain has kind of a very constant mapping throughout a lot of the vertebrate life forms. Okay, let's start down at the survival part, the brainstem. Composed of gray matter nuclei embedded in white matter. Remember, white matter are myelinated myelinated axons of neurons, and gray matter is the cell bodies, the dendrites, the glial cells, and so on. Brainstem composed of midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, and each one has its own specialty, all right? It's a pathway for tracks between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. So when you decide to move, the original thought takes place in your brain, but it has to go all the way down your spinal cord and go out to a spinal nerve to control those muscles. So those pathways, likewise sensory pathways, when you feel something on your arm, that's the sensory nerve brings the information into the spinal cord and then up to the brain. It has to pass through the brainstem. So a lot of pathways go through the brainstem. 10 of the 12 cranial nerves emerge from the brainstem. We don't get to cranial nerves until the 4th part of the class, but you're going to have to know all about the 12 cranial nerves. So just keep in mind, most of them are coming off of the brainstem. Many of the functions of the brainstem, as I said before, are survival-oriented. It's what's keeping you alive. So, good overview there. Nice slide to come back to. Shows the medulla, the pons, the midbrain, the thalamus up there. Get a good sense of the organization and layout of these things. We're going to be talking about them a lot. So the medulla oblongata continues with the spinal cord. In other words, there's no particular dividing line. There's no exact dividing line between the two. Mostly what it comes down to is that the spinal cord is just tracts. Once we get into the medulla, we start having nuclei as well. So the pyramids contain pyramidal tracts from upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex. As you'll see later, we talk about upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, which are basically your spinal nerves. So what has to happen here is that information, again, comes from the brain, down through the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and then out along spinal nerves to your body in order to allow you to do things. Now, the descending motor tracts cross over in the pyramids. Look in the bottom diagram there. See how the pyramids, they're raised up lumps in the medulla? The decussation means the crossing over. So what this means, therefore, is that skeletal muscles are controlled, for the most part, by contralateral cerebral hemisphere. In other words, the left hemisphere of your cerebrum is controlling the right side of your body. That's why, for example, in the instance of a stroke, someone has a stroke and suddenly they're having difficulty doing things on the right side of the body. That's a good indication that the stroke was on the left side, because in general, the descending motor pathways decussate. We'll see there are some exceptions later on, but most of them do that. Also in the medulla oblongata is the cardiovascular center, regulating cardiovascular function. Cardiac center regulates heart rate. Vasomotor center regulates the diameter of blood vessels, and that controls your blood pressure. So remember, medulla, survival. We're controlling the cardiovascular system down here. That's why damage to the medulla oblongata is often fatal. You lose the ability to control your heart rate and your blood pressure. Both centers function together to regulate blood pressure. Huge for survival, right? You can see there in the upper diagram those neurons coming down to the heart from the medulla oblongata. Continuing then, the olives, composed of the olivary nuclei, they relay proprioceptive signals from the joints and muscles to the cerebellum. Proprioception we've mentioned before, the ability of knowing where the rest of your body is in space, knowing where things around you are. I think I've used the example before. When you're driving your car and you need to step on the brake, you don't have to look down to see where the brake pedal is. At least I hope to God you don't. And if you do, then stop driving on the streets. Certainly don't drive on streets at the same time I am. Proprioception means knowing where the rest of your body is and its relationships to other parts and so on. So proprioceptive signals come through the olives, all right? And remember the cerebellum for smoothing and coordinating movement. That's what's going on. In order to do that, the cerebellum needs to know where are we now, in terms of our body position. Where's my arm now versus where does I want my arm to be? You need to know proprioceptive information so that you can compute smooth trajectories to do smooth fluid movement. The nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus are part of the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, the DCML, and I accidentally made two of those bullet points come up simultaneously. These are relaying somatosensory signals through the thalamus to the somatosensory areas in the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex where they are interpreted. We're going to talk about pathways later in these brain physiology PowerPoints, but remember how I said the brainstem has to have pathways going from the body to the brain and vice versa. They're both sensory and motor pathways. This is a huge sensory pathway. So somatosensory signals, these are the ones, the pain, pressure, temperature, a lot of your skin senses. They are coming up, going through the this pathway, the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, on their way to the parietal lobe, which, as we'll see later, the parietal lobe is the part of your brain that deals with incoming sensory information. Sensory impulses decussate. And so once again, just as we saw the motor signals decussate in the pyramids, a lot of these somatosensory signals decussate in the DCML. So once again, what that means is when something touches your left arm, that actually registers in the right side of your brain, registers in the right parietal lobe. So medulla oblongata, continuing here, cochlear, vestibular, and gustatory nuclei. Cochlear is for hearing, vestibular for balance, gustatory for taste. Relay signals for hearing, balance, and taste to the thalamus. Thalamus is part of the diencephalon. Remember, that's the command control center. What happens in the thalamus is it's going to route the signals to the correct parts of the cerebrum. So again, through the medulla oblongata, we have these pathways coming up from your body going to the cerebrum. Respiratory center regulates respiration, so we saw that there was the cardiovascular center to control breathing, to control blood pressure and heart rate rather. Respiratory center to control respiration. Once again, survival. Medulla oblongata. In nursing school, they tell you in a crisis, you're examining a patient, pay attention to the ABCs: airway, breathing, circulation. If somebody's not breathing, if they don't have a patent airway, if they're not able to control their heart rate and their blood pressure, they're not going to make it. So these are all in the medulla: breathing and heart rate and blood pressure. The medulla is what's regulating all of these. Those are essential for your survival. You won't last long if you're not breathing correctly and you're not controlling your heart rate and your blood pressure. Relay signals to the lungs. Vomiting center functions to rid the body of noxious substances in the GI tract. So think about it again, survival. If you've eaten something poisonous, you need to get it out of your body right now. So the vomiting center of the medulla, it's getting signals from other parts of the brain saying, holy smoke, we're getting poisons, toxins are coming in. And so the medulla says, holy smoke, stomach, whatever is down there, get rid of it right now. Other centers for coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, swallowing. So think about it again, the ABCs. Airway. If something's blocking your airway, you're not going to last very long. So if there's anything in your airway that's in the way of breathing, you need to get it out. How do you get it off? Cough, sneeze. Hiccuping is a weird one. Nobody really knows. It may be a remnant of the suckling reflex, which would be associated with swallowing. Swallowing, again, is a survival type of mechanism, because if you're not swallowing correctly, you might be swallowing food and water into your lungs, and you won't last long if you're doing that. So swallowing, again, is actually survival related. You've got to swallow down into your stomach, not into your lungs. So see, medulla oblongata, survival in so many ways, maybe even in ways you haven't thought of before as being related to survival. But hopefully now you're seeing that these are all survival kinds of things. Keep the airway clear, the ABCs. And the medulla contains nuclei for cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. You'll have to know all this when we get to the cranial nerves, so you can come back and look at this slide later. I won't ask you this on your third exam, but again, I always like to preview things ahead of time, warn you about the things coming up later, so that won't be the first time you've seen them when we get there later on. Alright, so above the medulla is the pons. The pons is the big bulge. So look in the upper part of the illustration. That big blue bulge in the brainstem. That's the pons. Pons in Latin means bridge, because the pons really is the bridge between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Remember the cerebellum? Balance, posture, smoothing, and coordinating movements. So the cerebellum has to communicate with the rest of the brain. How does it do that? Well, its signals come in the area of the pons, and then they're able to ascend and go up, or descend and go out to the cerebellum. So the pons is the bridge between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. The bridge. Relay signals from cerebellum to the motor cortex of the cerebrum via the cerebellar peduncles. Peduncles are the connecting points between the cerebellum and the pons, or the brainstem. So, again, what has to happen here is that when you decide to make a movement, the last place that the commands to move are coming from are up on the cerebrum. But again, the cerebellum has to know what it is you want to do so that it can help smooth out and coordinate those movements. So there's constant back and forth between the cerebrum and the cerebellum in order to make sure that everything is sequenced just right. And the pons is where that communication is happening. Smooths and coordinates voluntary muscle movements. Contains nuclei for cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. Again, you don't have to know that for your third exam. You will for the fourth exam, so I'm just putting it in here. This will be a good PowerPoint to come back and look at later, because it summarizes it all. Contains nuclei that are part of the reticular system, which functions in awareness. So, the reticulars, there are lots of parts of the brain that have to do with sleep and with consciousness. The reticular system sort of monitors your senses to see what's happening around you and kind of decides whether or not it's safe to go to sleep. And then while you are asleep, if something is happening that you need to be aware of, that you need to be alert and awake for, reticular system is involved in part of helping to wake you up so you become ready to deal with what's going on. We'll talk about the reticular system more later, but just think of it as in sort of awareness of what's happening around you, and then it kind of functions as the on-off switch. It's what finally says, okay, it's okay to go to sleep, and switches it off. Or vice versa again, if something horrible is happening while you're asleep, reticular system helps in making sure that we turn that switch back on and regain consciousness so we can deal with the crisis around us. And respiratory centers help the medulla regulate respiration. That's another main, huge function of the pons. It has the ventral respiratory group, the dorsal respiratory group. These help the medulla regulate breathing. So the medulla is most directly in charge of breathing. The pons help set the rate It helps adjust breathing, either increasing respirations, decreasing respirations. So it's involved in assisting the medulla control breathing. Okay, so the midbrain, now we're up at the very top of the brainstem, so look there. Follow along as we do this, all right? So that kind of pinkish and orangish area, that's where the spinal cord turned into the medulla oblongata. The blue was the pons, and now we're up into the green area, the midbrain, the very top of the brainstem, where we are about to connect to the thalamus, part of the diencephalon. So midbrain is the most superior structure of the brainstem. Functions in many aspects of motor control, vision and hearing, and alertness. So once again, part of the reticular system again, maintaining the alertness and monitoring alertness. And then also, as we'll see coming up, vision and hearing awareness, all right? So the cerebral peduncles connect the brainstem to the cerebrum. We talked a moment ago about the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellar peduncles connected the cerebellum to the brainstem. The cerebral peduncles connect the cerebrum to the brainstem. So again, the brainstem has to be able to communicate with both cerebellum and cerebrum. It does that through the peduncles. Don't mix these up. They look kind of similar, cerebral, cerebellar, but they're very, very different. Cerebral peduncles connect brainstem to cerebrum. Cerebellar peduncles connect brainstem to cerebellum. Those are hugely different. So notice here we're looking here at the brainstem. You can see some of the things in the lower diagram there, optic nerve, optic chiasm. There you see cerebral peduncle. We'll come back and talk about that optic stuff more in a little while. So continuing with the midbrain, the tectum, Latin, that means roof, consists of the quadrigeminal bodies. Now note quad means four, right? So there are four bodies. So look on that diagram. See how there are four blue lumps? See? So there are the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. So there are two superior colliculi. Each one is a superior colliculus, a left one and a right one. And then there are two inferior colliculi, a left inferior colliculus and a right inferior colliculus. 1, 2, 3, 4 makes 4, so that's the quadrigeminal bodies. Superior colliculus is the visual reflex and tracking center. So, like if you're sitting just kind of, daydreaming, looking ahead, and suddenly there's a big flash of light off to your left, you will automatically turn your head to orient to where that flash of light came from. It's not something you have to consciously decide. It's not like you go, I think I'll look at that big flash of light off to the left. That happens instantaneously, and that's because the superior colliculus is basically moderating all of that. It's making sure that you orient your eyes to something important happening out there in your environment. Uses visual input to control movement of the head and eyes to follow visual stimuli. Visual tracking as well. If there's a wasp flying around the room and you don't want to get stung, you're having to follow the wasp with your eyes and your head. You don't have to consciously think, let's see, I'm going to move my eyes upward and to the left. Now I'm going to turn my head to the left. No, if you had to do that, you'd screw it up, just like you've screwed up the rest of your life. Thank goodness the superior colliculus does all of that automatically. It allows you, without even thinking, to follow a visual stimulus and to track it as it's moving. And then the inferior colliculus is the same thing, but for the auditory centers. So, in other words, once again, if you're sitting daydreaming and suddenly there's an explosion off to your left, you don't have to think, geez, I better look and see what that explosion was. You automatically orient your ears and your head to where the sound came from. That's the inferior colliculus. Uses auditory input to control movement and the head to orient to auditory stimuli. Both together are involved in what's called the startle reflex. Again, if something major is happening around you, you need to know what's going on. Remember, in general, brainstem is survival oriented. You better figure out what the hell is going on out there. So the colliculi help you automatically orient. They help control muscles of the head and the neck and so on, so you make sure you see what's happening. So imagine for a moment that some poor dog is having to sit here and listen to me talk. Oh my God, yeah, and obviously the dog would be asleep by now, wouldn't it? But imagine, you've seen this before. You've had this experience. Like there's a dog over there, got its head down, kind of snoozing. What happens if you suddenly snap your fingers? Like, imagine in your mind's eye, what happened? You got a dog kind of relaxing like that, and suddenly you go with your fingers. What does that dog do? Yeah. I wish I could have found a picture of the same dog. Dogs obviously don't change species when you snap your, they're the same species. They don't change breeds when you snap your fingers. But I think you get the idea, right? That's the startle reflex. That's the superior and inferior colliculi automatically orienting you to what's happening around you so that you can survive, all right? Or in the case of dogs, like food, walk. Yeah, sure, dogs, they are always interested in what's going on because you control their lives. So continuing here with the midbrain, the cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and that happens here. So we haven't really talked about ventricles yet. Ventricles are sacs of cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. And you have 4 ventricles altogether. You have 2 lateral ventricles, then a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle. Well, the third and fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid flows through the spinal cord and through the brain. So there has to be a constant flow. Therefore, there have to be pathways. So the cerebral aqueduct is a thing that carries water. Agua, water. Romans, built aqueducts all over the place. So aqueducts carry water. So here we have an aqueduct, a water carrier, that helps carry cerebrospinal fluid between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Then surrounding the cerebral aqueduct is the periaqueductal gray matter, the PAG. This will become important later on because it's in part where pain signals are processed. So the PAG, we'll come back to that again. It links the amygdala also to the autonomic nervous system. So the amygdala is a part of the brain that is involved in emotional responses. It has to do some with memory as well. The autonomic nervous system, remember, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, again involved in crisis. So the amygdala often is involved in the processing of fear and of alertness and so on. It connects to the autonomic nervous system so that we can make the appropriate responses in a crisis situation. It's going to assist the sympathetic nervous system in response to fear. That's a big job. And then descending pathways from the periaqueductal gray matter suppress ascending pain signals in the spinal cord. So in a crisis situation, imagine that one of your children is trapped in a burning house, and you go to the burning house, and the doorknob leading into the house is scalding hot. It's red hot. In order to open that doorknob, you'll have to sustain severe burns on your hand. Well, if pain pathways were so automatic that you couldn't override them, then your child would be trapped in the house and they would die. So you have inhibiting signals as well for pain. Coming from the PAG, they descend. They suppress pain signals so that you can go ahead and sustain that second or third degree burn as you need to in order to open the door to get into the house to save your kid. So again, look at all the connections here. Fear, crisis, pain, all right? A lot of that is all being regulated here. Brainstem, survival. Keep that in mind. Brainstem deals with survival. So continuing, finishing up the midbrain, let's take a look here. Red nucleus, named for its color, there's a lot of iron in there. It contains nuclei for motor pathways that control voluntary limb flexion and arm swing when walking. So you may have noticed that when you walk, your arms swing side to side. Well, that's an automatic response. Also, voluntarily moving your arms, you have to be able to do that in order to get a glass of water and, to push away people who are trying to touch you and things like that. So, red nuclei has motor pathways for a lot of that upper body movement, that arm swing stuff, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. Then there's the substantia nigra, named for its color. It's got a lot of melanin. So in this case, of course, you can see where it says in the diagram, substantia nigra. They didn't make it black, but it's got lots of black spots in there. That's all melanin, all right? Substantia nigra, literally in Latin, means the black stuff, okay? So we have the red nucleus and the black stuff, the two colored areas here in the midbrain. So what's going on with the substantia nigra? So dopaminergic neurons, so these are neurons that use dopamine as their neurotransmitter, they synapse in the putamen of the basal nuclei. We'll talk about the basal nuclei later. But they have to do with a lot of unconscious or involuntary movement. The stuff, again, like the arm swing. You're not consciously thinking, oh, I'm going to swing my arms while I walk. That happens automatically. These are some of what we're going to call later on the extrapyramidal pathways. So red nucleus and substantia nigra, notice both here in the midbrain, both have to do with movement, with movement control. Now an interesting thing happens. In some cases, the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra die. Why that happens is still partly mysterious. Maybe genetic components, maybe environmental components. But when they do die, that leads to what's called Parkinson's disease, a very well-known disorder. You may have heard of it before, and we'll talk about it more later on. Midbrain, again, contains nuclei for cranial nerves 3 and 4. So I reminded you all along the way where these cranial nerve nuclei are. Now, when you look at that diagram on the upper half, to me that looks like an upside-down monkey face. Can you see that? So I wanted to show you how, if you kind of remember it's the monkey face, that helps me remember what's what. Again, the little stupid things I have in my own head. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, then throw it away. But see, I put a picture of a monkey upside down there in the bottom. So the monkey's mouth would be the cerebral aqueduct. See, up on top, cerebral aqueduct, that's where CSF is flowing, all right? The monkey's lips would be the periaqueductal gray matter, the PAG, all right, where the descending pain suppression signals are originating. Then the monkey's eyes would be the red nucleus, all right? The monkey's eyebrows would be the substantia nigra, and then the monkey's forehead is the cerebral peduncle. So one of the things with the brain that's hard to do is you're constantly looking at things from, either in this case, a horizontal section, or you're looking sometimes a coronal section or a sagittal. It's hard to put all that together into 3D. It just takes practice. I'm going to keep reminding you of that. But in this case, we're looking down from above, and we're seeing that cerebral peduncle. This is where the cerebrum would be sort of coming down over the brainstem, kind of like the cap on a mushroom, and the cerebrum would be grabbing a hold of the brainstem at the cerebral peduncle. So think of this as kind of like it's the cap of the mushroom, that's the cerebrum, that comes down and kind of flows over and then comes around and grabs the brainstem at the midbrain at the cerebral peduncle. All right? So stick with it. Let's look at some more brain physiology in our next PowerPoint.